Dawn crept lazily through the curtains, hesitant to announce a new day. Daniel had been awake for hours. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept without interruption. Lying in bed, he felt the cold on one side of his body, as if his presence there was more of an accident than a choice. Beside him, Julia slept deeply. Her breathing was slow and steady, completely unaware of the storm raging in his mind. He turned toward her, watching her in the dim light. Her expression was peaceful, just as it always was after an argument, after her voice had risen above his, after she had made him feel smaller than he ever thought possible. She always slept soundly, as if the harsh words from the night before had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of the pain she had inflicted so effortlessly. The reason for the fight had been trivial, as always. Maybe he had forgotten to buy bread. Maybe he hadn't replied to a message quickly enough. The excuse never really mattered. The pattern was always the same. Julia would raise her voice, let out a dry laugh, and look at him like a clumsy child in need of correction. "God, Daniel, how can you be so useless?" she had said one night when he forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. The first time she called him useless, Daniel felt a sharp sting in his stomach, like a punch he hadn't seen coming. But over time, it became routine. The insults came wrapped in irritation, as if his very existence was a burden to her. At first, he tried to defend himself. "I'm sorry, I forgot," he murmured that night, hoping that would be enough. But it never was. "Of course you forgot, like everything else. I always have to stay on top of you, because if I don't, you just forget. You have responsibilities, Daniel. You're an adult. How is it even possible that someone like you managed to get a decent job?" Shame rose in his throat, suffocating. He lowered his gaze, staring at the table as if that might make him invisible. But Julia wasn't satisfied with silence. She needed to make sure her words hit their mark. "It's not difficult, Daniel. Going to the dry cleaners doesn't require any special skills. I'm not asking you to cure cancer, just to do one thing right. But of course, that's too much for you." She crossed her arms, shook her head, and let out an exaggerated sigh. Daniel wanted to defend himself, to tell her he hadn't meant to forget, that he had been working late at the office, that his mind had been overwhelmed with too many things. But he knew the truth. It wouldn't matter, and no matter how insignificant his mistake was, it always ended the same way. Daniel felt like a scolded child, like someone who constantly had to prove he was worthy of basic respect. One night, after yet another argument, he decided to try a different approach. In a calm, conciliatory tone, he said, "Julia, do you realize how you talk to me sometimes? I feel like everything I do is wrong." She looked at him as if he had just said the most ridiculous thing in the world. "Are you seriously saying I treat you badly? Don't be so dramatic, Daniel. Now you're the victim?" She rolled her eyes. "My God, what ridiculous sensitivity. Do I have to talk to you like a child just so you don't get offended?" "No, I'd like you to speak to me with a little more respect," he said carefully. Julia let out a dry laugh, leaning against the doorway. "Respect?" she repeated mockingly. "For that, you'd first have to do something worthy of respect." That sentence hit him harder than he wanted to admit. He fell silent, the words catching in his throat. Julia turned and left the room, leaving him alone with his frustration, alone with the realization that any attempt to stand up for himself was pointless. Over time, Daniel stopped arguing. He stopped correcting her when she exaggerated his mistakes in front of others. He stopped trying to prove to her that he wasn't the failure she made him out to be. He simply stopped expecting things to change. And that was his worst mistake. He realized it when he saw how Julia changed around other people. In public, she transformed. She was charming, witty, effortlessly confident. She could talk about any subject with ease. She smiled, joked, and held his hand affectionately, acting as if she weren't the same person who belittled her behind closed doors. At first, Daniel wanted to believe that this version of her was real, that maybe, deep down, she still loved him, that perhaps the woman who laughed and introduced him with pride was the true Julia. But over time, he understood the truth. Her sweetness wasn't for him. It was for the audience. It was a carefully staged performance. And he was just another prop in the set. One night, at a gathering with friends, Someone asked him about an important project at work. Just as he began to speak, Julia let out a light-hearted laugh. Oh, don't put too much pressure on him. He's not exactly the best at giving speeches. The group laughed with her, oblivious to the way he tensed up. It wasn't just a harmless joke. It was a subtle way of making him feel small, of ensuring everyone saw him the way she wanted them to. Clumsy, incapable, someone not to be taken seriously. But tell me, Daniel, how is it that your company is revamping the whole system? He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, Julia sighed and took a sip of her wine. Oh, honey, that's not exactly it. But don't worry, it's a complicated topic. Again, laughter. Again, the message was clear. You're not smart enough to talk about this. From that moment on, Daniel started noticing a pattern. At every gathering, every dinner with friends, every family event, Julia made sure to slip in little remarks that ridiculed him, never enough for others to recognize, but always enough for him to feel it. The weight of her words was never heavy enough for others to notice, but just enough for Daniel to feel his dignity crumble, piece by piece. Daniel is terrible with directions. You have no idea how many times we've ended up lost because of him, she once said during a lunch with her in-laws. If they gave him an award for forgetting things, he'd probably forget to pick it up, she joked on another occasion in front of their friends. And always, there was laughter, because Julia made it seem harmless, like a private joke between spouses. A little teasing. Nothing serious. But to Daniel, it wasn't a joke. It was a constant reminder that, to her, he would never be enough. The worst part was that no one noticed. To everyone else, Julia was a charming, patient wife, and he was simply the absent-minded, forgetful husband, lucky to have someone who tolerated him. One day, after yet another dinner filled with her casual humiliations, Daniel finally found the courage to ask, "Why do you do that? Why do you always have to make me look like a fool in front of everyone?" Julia raised an eyebrow, smiling with condescension. "Oh, Daniel, don't be so dramatic. They're just jokes. Or do you not have a sense of humor now either?" But they weren't jokes. They were daggers disguised as humor. And Daniel was finally realizing that he was bleeding. It wasn't just one fight that led him to his decision. It was years of small, accumulated wounds that left no visible scars, but it turned him into a man he no longer recognized. The breaking point came on an ordinary afternoon. No shouting matches. No outright insults. No slammed doors or fists on the table. Just another comment. One of many. But this time it hit differently. They had gone grocery shopping together. Something they rarely did. As they walked through the aisles, Daniel stopped to look at the wine bottles. "Maybe we could get one for dinner on Friday," he said, not thinking much of it. Julia, focused on her shopping list, didn't even glance up. "Why? You don't know anything about wine. You'd probably pick the worst one." A flat, emotionless remark. A casual judgment, like stating an obvious fact. And yet, something inside Daniel ignited. It wasn't about the wine. It wasn't even about the comment itself. It was the exhaustion of living under the constant assumption that he was incapable, that no matter what he did, he would always fall short. He stayed silent, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if, after all these years, he finally understood. Nothing he did would ever change the way she saw him. That night, when they got home, Daniel did something different. Instead of letting himself be dragged into their usual routine, he went to his desk, opened his laptop, and started something new. He searched for divorce attorneys. For a long time, he just stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of him still wanted to believe it wasn't necessary, that maybe things could improve if they talked, if they tried to change. But another part, one that was more honest, knew the truth. He had spent too long waiting for a change that would never come. The next day, during his lunch break at the office, he made the call. "I want a divorce." The attorney on the other end of the line was silent for a moment. Then, with the calm voice of someone who had heard those words many times before, he asked, "Have you discussed this with her?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "No, she won't take it well." "Physical abuse?" "No. Emotional. It wasn't a question. Daniel felt a knot in his throat. He had never said those words out loud before. Yes. The lawyer began explaining the process, the legal options and next steps. But Daniel's mind drifted elsewhere. He saw every argument, every cutting remark, every moment that had slowly chipped away at him. That afternoon, when he left the office, he knew there was no turning back. For the first time in years, he felt like he was making a decision for himself, a decision that didn't seek her approval, a decision that didn't depend on how she would react, a decision that was his alone. Daniel stood up calmly, took his coat from the rack, and slid it over his shoulders with a deliberate motion. There was no rush, no anger, just the quiet certainty of someone who, after a long time, had made a decision without fear. Julia remained seated at the table, holding the divorce papers as if they were a bomb about to detonate. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, her fingers drumming anxiously against the surface. "You're making a mistake," she finally said, her voice more strained than usual. She didn't sound angry. She sounded unsettled. Daniel paused in the doorway and looked at her one last time. For years, he had waited to hear something different from her. Something that wasn't contempt disguised as advice. Something that wasn't mockery hidden behind a joke. But now, he realized it didn't matter. It didn't matter if she tried to hurt him one last time. It didn't matter if she pretended to be surprised, to not understand why he was leaving. "Maybe," he said with a faint smile. One free of resentment. One filled only with certainty. He opened the door and walked out without looking back. The cold morning air hit his face as he crossed the street. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the weight of her words, her criticisms, her control. He took a deep breath, and with every step, he felt the invisible chains he had carried for so long begin to fall away. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he had something he had never had with her, the freedom to choose his own path.